It's the Fire of Truth podcast.
We'd like to welcome you all again to the world of vibration. Introduction to the nation, a revolutionary thought. Hear the sound evolve, expanding, changing. Most of the things that we saying haven't broken through your chatter, so y'all niggas still ego trip based in. Have not begun to taste the Kundalini wisdom bliss I'm dropping as a lyric quoting vessel for the sages. Play this on your playlist. I like dope, but musically I'm transcending the physical. And don't blame me for the slang and the word. God writes these rhymes through me. I just listen to them. I'm just living through matrix-driven rules haven't fooled me, cause I still think abstract and stay metaphysical and challenge what is really real and keep creating with the force to bring rap back.
Welcome to another episode of the Fire of Truth podcast. I am your host, JT Leber, and this week, as every week on the Fire of Truth podcast, we are going to delve into topics that have to do with spirituality, New Age ideas, with religion, philosophy, and today is no different. We're going to investigate what's true, what's untrue, what might be true, what's been said by who and when, that favorite academic endeavor. But this week we are going to go into a topic that is essential. I think it underlies everything. It's at the foundation. It's talked about in just about every single religion you can imagine. And it's spoke of in different ways, and there are different ideas about it. And that is the Akashic Records. That's right, the Akashic Records. Now, if you've never heard about the Akashic Records, it's really fascinating. So the Akashic Records are the records of all of history. It's the recording of time. It's the recording of every act and deed. Everything that has happened in the past is said to be recorded in the Akashic Records, and some say that everything that could have happened or that will happen is also there in the Akashic Records. It's something that psychics and mediums use to connect and gain their information. It could be seen as a type of consciousness. Maybe it could be the very foundation of our reality. So what we're going to look at today, we want to look at the different ways the Akashic Record has been talked about throughout history and in different religions, where there have been mentions of it, even some more modern day people who have used the records in order to do their work, what they have to say about it. And yeah, we're going to kind of dive in and see where science takes us too. Like, is there any connection with the records and what quantum mechanics, quantum physics, the new physics is telling us, right? Does it have a really strong sense of explanatory power when it comes to ghost or other things or intuition? So we're going to get all into all that this week. So I'm going to start with the definition of Akashic Records. Now, where does that word Akashic come from? It comes from Sanskrit. And the root word is kas, which means to be. So if you're into philosophy at all, you know that the word to be, or Shakespeare said, to be or not to be, it's very essential, it's very foundational, whether something is or is not. And there's so much debate, especially in philosophical literature, when you get into it about what is being. What does it mean to exist or to not exist? And so Akashic, Kas means to be. Now Akashic means the ether, sky, or atmosphere. So it's seeing as something above or around. And in Advaita Vedanta tradition, which is a particular form of Hinduism, it has a technical meaning, which is an ethereal fluid imagined as pervading the cosmos. So the Akashic is seen as something pervading and throughout all things, perhaps as the base. Now, in Hinduism, they believe that the Vedas, their ancient scripture, actually came out of the Akasha, as well as the old sacred language Sanskrit, that this came out of the Akasha. So it's hard for us to imagine being 21st century, physical-based humans, to imagine that language and religion itself, an ancient holy text, could come to us from the spiritual realm. But that's essentially the understanding in Hinduism, is that the Akashic provided the Vedas, which some claim are up to 5,000 years old and possibly older, and maybe the oldest recorded documents that we have, some of the oldest books, such as the Rig Veda. So this knowledge comes to us from the Akasha. And it's understood that if you're a spiritually inept, that if you're a very advanced spiritual practitioner, that you have the ability to read the Akashic Records. Now, this gets into some very interesting ideas. The idea that as humans, we're able to read the Akashic Records. We're able to read what has happened in the past, that we're able to see what may happen in the future. But before we get too much further into reading the Akashic Records, let's take a look at how some of the major religions and some not so major religions have viewed the Akashic Records before, and what kind of words that they use to describe them. So we'll start with Christianity and Judaism. And in their religion, it's referred to as the Book of Life or the Book of Remembrance. So, for instance, in Psalms 139:16, your eyes have seen my unformed substance, and in your book were all written the days that were ordained for me, whereas yet there was not one of them. And another one from Exodus. Then Moses returned to the Lord and said, Alas, this people has committed a great sin, and they have made a god of gold for themselves. But now, if you will, forgive their sin, and if not, please blot me out from your book, which you have written. The Lord said to Moses, Whoever has sinned against me, I will blot him out of my book. And there are several other places where they talk about the book and either being removed from the book or being rescued or saved because that individual was in the book of life or the book of remembrance. And so the idea in Christianity and Judaism seemed to be that the record has to do with one's either your sins, your transgressions, or the way that you act on the day-to-day. So it has to do with your ethical behavior, and that's recorded in the book of life. And so the notions of the judgment of God and the fear of God, well, everything that you do is being recorded in these books. So it's very central, and the idea that there is no deed that goes undone, or there's no deed that does not get recorded, is central here. And so then we have in Islam, it's called the Preserved Tablet. And a couple quotes. In the Preserved Tablet, guarded from every accursed devil and secure from any falsehood, which is the Quran 85:22. And then we have from the Quran 6:59, and with him are the keys of the unseen. None knows them except him, and he knows what is on the land and in the sea. Not a leaf falls but that he knows it, and no grain is there within the darknesses of the earth, and no moist or dry thing, but that it is written in a clear record. So we can see that from just these few examples in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, how there seems to be this idea of a record book that is recording everything that occurs. And especially in that last Quran passage, and no grain is there within the darkness of the earth that is not there in a clear record. It's interesting to imagine that all of our thoughts, our deeds, every physical thing, whether it's a leaf falling from a tree or whether it's a thought that you've had, is recorded on these records, in the Akashic Records. People who practice like the law of attraction or follow Abraham Hicks or Esther Hicks, they talk about how thoughts are things. And it's true in, the Think and Grow Rich community too. They say that thoughts are things. And the idea is that these things, these thoughts are recorded. And as we go farther in, we'll see that it's possible to actually access any thought that was had or any action that was done, because it is actually recorded in the Akashic Records. So this brings me to the pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles, and he talks about a man who was able to read the records that he had come across. And his passage goes, "There was among them a man of rare knowledge, highly skilled in all kinds of wise words, possessing the utmost wealth of wisdom. Whenever he reached out with all his mind, he was easily aware of every particular thing that exists, spanning even 10 or 20 generations of men." So Empedocles wrote this, somewhere over 2,000 years ago. So the idea of this record keeping and the ability to access it has been around for a very, very long time. This is not some completely new, made-up fad. This is something that's been going on since humans were recording their own history. Now I want to touch on Theosophy. Now, if you don't know what Theosophy is, don't worry. You don't have to have a complete understanding of it. But it was a religion, still in practice by some today. It began in the late 19th century by a woman named H.P. Blavatsky. And there was another individual named Leber who founded Theosophy. And what Theosophy is, it's an attempt at getting to the truth. Theosophy meaning like divine knowledge, knowledge of God. So they took what they could find, whether it was in mystery schools or, Western mystery schools or even Hinduism, Buddhism, and they tried to condense it almost in a Western fashion. So very detailed, philosophical. But the idea was to help people to divine this stuff and access this knowledge for themselves. So they obviously had a lot to say about the Akashic Records. And their claim is that the records are much more than simply like a static data collection. It's much more than just like recording what's going on, what has been thought. It's actually the impetus for future growth. So from the records and like what we have and what we've done comes what might be. And it moves in a progression. So the records are they're similar to the life force. So not only are the things recorded, it's like the soil, right? It's like if you plant a seed in the soil, like the soil is actually nurturing and helping that seed to sprout forth into a tree. So the records can be a stimulus, and they provide that creativity needed to move forward. Now, in the same way though, the records, in the same way like a soil doesn't guarantee that a tree will go properly, the Akashic Records do not guarantee the future that will come forth. Now, perhaps that's debatable. Some see it as it has been written and it will occur. Others see the records as potential. And so this like moving forward, that the things that have been said and thought have a certain foundation now. So any thought that you think has its own reality, and the records record that. Now, whether you are able to nurture that and bring that thought into fruition and manifestation in this world has to do with how you tend to it and how you care. It's very much you will reap what you sow. Okay? So if we can imagine a thought being something that's placed into the records, into that field, into the universe, then how we nurture that and how we experience that and what we believe about that and what we feel about that is then what will manifest. And that's very basic law of attraction stuff. But, as you reap, well, that's how you sowed. No, how you sow, you will reap. What you reap is what you sow. So where's your attention going? So the Theosophical Society also suggests that, the records contain what has been and what could have been and what is. Now, in my hypnosis practice, I'll occasionally do forward life progressions where I will help an individual look at their life. If they address this issue and correct it, what could that look like? And then also, if you don't address this issue, what kind of future life could you be looking at? Because everything is a potential, and everything has a lot more to do with our ethical actions and decisions and our feelings and emotions towards ourselves and others. It's really shaping our future, and it's happening every second of every day. Now, I know that seems intense and it can easily be overwhelming, but when you can develop a sense of peace and a sense of centeredness, then those things that seem overwhelming and that could get out of hand, I know it can seem overwhelming that I have to monitor everything I think. Because if I think the wrong things or if I feel the wrong way, then I know that my future is going to be bad. But instead of seeing it that way, if we can realize to have peace in the moment, which can mean breathing, it can mean centering yourself, it means going on a walk. If we can find ourselves in the present moment, in a calm, embodied place, then we can begin to choose where our future is heading. If we can find our passion, if we can find what excites us, and if we can get narrow and focus into that, then that's how we know what our future is going to be. That's when our future becomes this exciting, hopeful potential. So Theosophy claims that a man may read the records when he is involved into a true individual enlightened state. They say that the records themselves are very difficult to read clearly, that they're actually mirrored. So like if you can imagine, if you look at a lake that's flat, it's easy to see the reflection and it's very clear. So the person who is enlightened, who has attained this higher spiritual level, is able to see the clear lake and is able to see that reflection just as it is. Maybe there's still a little distortion, but it's rather clear. Now, often, most people haven't obtained that sort of spiritual enlightenment. So we see ripples and waves. Things are distorted, and they might not be perfectly accurate. So this is something I think is fascinating, because when we try to understand like people who are mediums or people who are psychics or channels, how is it that they can access information? Intuitives who do tarot readings, how can they make sense of the cards that they see? Because it would be one thing, I'm sure there are tarot readers out there who just read the cards as they see them. But there are others who are intuitives who see the cards and can gain a sense from either spiritual guides or from the individual, or they're pulling from something else that helps explain and give meaning to the cards for the context of that individual specifically, right? So what is it that allows for that? Well, I love the idea that it's something like the Akashic Records, something that this information is out there and that it's recorded and that it's available to us. Now, we might not be precise. Our readings might not be perfect, but there are varying degrees of people. I mean, that's why we don't trust all the mediums that we see, or trust all the seers, or the people who speak with angels, or the departed, or those who give future forecast. But then there are people like Nostradamus, and people like Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner, who have seen the records and who have shown and has been recorded about their accuracy. There's a reason the oracles at Delphi, the Greek oracles, were so revered, because what they did had a sort of accuracy to them. They would not have been a big deal if they were unable to accurately predict or accurately guide the individuals that came to them. Now, it's easy with our scientific modern brains to say this is mumbo jumbo and they were just a bunch of people pretending and believing in whatever they saw because they couldn't understand the world around them. And part of that may be true, but I think you're giving people less credit for their intelligence. If there was nothing to it, it would not have succeeded. I'm a firm believer that the phony end up weeding themselves out in the long run. So, if we could see this as the access of the records. So let's start from this view. And Rudolf Steiner, who he was a part of the Theosophical movement, ended up breaking away from them and then started anthroposophy. Gosh, it's a hard word to say. Which has to do with human wisdom. The wisdom of being a human being. He was able to read the records and brought lots of information back. And the reason I personally give him lots of credence and have a lot of faith in what he has said and wrote, and he has wrote and made copious amounts of material, books and all the rest of it, lecture series. Now, he lived in the early 1900s to about the mid 1900s. But he is responsible for biodynamic farming, for the anthroposophy movement that there are still practitioners of. He created the Waldorf education system, which has over 1,000 schools across the world. And it's just been this steady growth since its inception. He has given us a new understanding of health and nutrition and what a balanced diet looks like. The knowledge that he's brought back has been tested over time and continues to grow. And so he did a lot of readings on the Akashic Records about the time of Jesus. And if you're a Christian or possibly had been a Christian and are interested in like mysticism and the deeper spiritual significance of what the Christ is, reading Rudolf Steiner it's a great place to start and to go into that deeper. He offers great explanation of what the Christ impulse was. So like who was Jesus? What is this spiritual impetus that came into existence at that time in the Holy Land? And what is it about that has continued forward to today to be such a big deal and like one of the biggest religions on earth, right? What is it about the Christ that did that? And if you're interested from a more spiritual perspective on what that is, Steiner is a great place to begin and kind of dive into that. That was a little bit as an aside. But I wanted to read a couple things that Steiner wrote about the Akashic Records and how everything is recorded. So he writes, everything that happens in the physical sense world has its counterpart in the spiritual world. When a hand is moved, there is more before you than the moving hand seen by your eye. There is my thought and my volition, my hand must move. A spiritual background is there, whereas the ocular sensible impression of the hand passes away. Its spiritual counterpart remains engraved in the spiritual world and unfailingly leaves a trace there, so that when our spiritual eyes are opened, we can follow the traces and find the spiritual counterpart of everything that has happened in the world. Nothing can happen in the world without leaving such traces. He continues, let us suppose the spiritual investigator lets his gaze wander back to the days of Charlemagne, or to Roman times, or to ancient Greece. Everything that happened in those times is preserved in the trace left by its spiritual prototype and can be observed in the spiritual world. This kind of vision is called reading the Akashic Records. So, so that is just, it's so very fascinating. The idea that everything that has occurred is recorded on these records. It's recorded on, well, we can call it the Akashic Records, but obviously, well, yeah, we use it's a difficult concept to explain because we say Akashic Records and we like to think that it's like some book somewhere or like a library where we can go and browse and pick out a book on the shelf and say, oh, what happened in 1733 in this place at this time. And yes, maybe like that intention is the way we access that, but maybe it's not a library. Maybe it's not books, but it's like the actual foundation of reality itself. And it seems like such a daunting thing to imagine that we can access this. But I do think it's possible. And I think that these kind of truths come to us, like in our intuition, like traces of the Akashic Records, of that creating, forward-moving reality. It comes to us in our gut instincts. It comes to us in our dreams when we dream of the future, or if we dream of being somewhere in the far past. You know, these are examples of us accessing this information. And so Steiner was very adamant that any individual who wishes to access the records can do so, but that it can take immense spiritual training. And he was very keyed in that you would have to have just mass amounts of patience, and that you need to be able to conduct spiritual exercises and meditations for, thousands of hours without seeing any results in order to move forward and really to develop. That's the kind of patience you would have. Now, he wanted to make sure that what the spiritual practitioner experienced was true. So that's why he had this very strong emphasis on patience, slow, steady, stride and true development is what Steiner was really into. Now, I think we're capable of accessing parts of the records, and if we do it in the right way, even though they might not be perfect or clear, we can still use it to guide ourselves. And this is actually what I think occurs when I help people doing like a past life regression. So, typically with the past life regression, what comes through, we start by having the best intent in mind. We want to help the person who's having the regression to solve a problem or to gain information to make a decision. We want guidance. That's why we do the past life regressions to begin with. And even if we do them just out of a curiosity to experience the regression, what comes forth is something that's pertinent to that individual. You're not going to have a past life regression that shows you as, I don't know, just some joker somewhere in the world who did nothing and it has no relation to like what your life is currently. It's going to have some meaning and some import. So, we always ask to have that kind of revelation when we do the past life regressions, that what comes forth is pertinent. And I think that's what happens. So we go into that meditative state. Now, our recollection of our past life may not be perfect. We might not actually remember the perfect details that we would like because we might not be able to spiritually. But we will at least see the lake, right? Even if the water is choppy and we can't see it clearly, we will get something to work with. And if our intention is pure, then we'll get what we need from it. So I think we can work with the Akashic Records in a trance state, led by a professional hypnotist, or you can train yourself to get into that state using certain audios, or even if you're just daydreaming, if you can get into a daydream state, those can be very powerful for your imagination to run and to see what kind of images come up, to see what happens. I think there's a connection there. I wonder if we're actually ever like apart from the records. Because if everything we do, everything we think or say is recorded, then it's so intimate. Like, are we ever really apart from it? So Steiner, Rudolf Steiner, who I spoke about earlier, also talks about thinking as being a spiritual activity. So the thought is something that actually comes to us. And if we can be aware of that, it might be said that the thought itself is coming to us from the records. And it might be what we're nurturing, and it might be what we're giving our attention to, is the kind of thoughts that we're receiving from a spiritual perspective. And so, what are you thinking about, right? Like, where's your focus? Where's your intention? The energy flows where your intention goes. So get clear on what it is that you want and what you want to focus on. And funnel that. Put it out there. And by putting it out there, you're stirring up the potential that exists in those records. Because if you can think something, it exists in a very real way. Esther Hicks talks about this. Abraham. And if you're not familiar with her, Esther Hicks channels Abraham, who's very much law of attraction. She's fascinating. Look her up if you haven't. Abraham Hicks. But Abraham talks about how if you think it, if you can think a thought, if you can see yourself in the place you want to be, let's say I imagine myself, in a mansion that's mine, for example's sake. Just that thought itself has already created this reality in the spiritual realm, in the Akashic Records. That it's there, it's created. And the way that I bring that into manifestation is through releasing any resistance and allowing that thought to grow and be nurtured. And so it goes from a thought to being recorded to being something real in the spiritual world. And then the bringing it into this physical world is just a matter of attention and focus, allowing, releasing resistance. And that potential will push itself forward into existence. Another individual who I mentioned earlier is Edgar Cayce. Now, I think in the future I'm going to highlight some individuals who just had extraordinary lives, such as Rudolf Steiner, Edgar Cayce, Jiddu Krishnamurti, and really do a deep dive, probably a whole episode, to help introduce my viewers into them, why I think they were so important, what they accomplished in their life, and how their legacy lives on. And I think that's something especially with like writing or art, you can really tell who had a foundation in truth and had a soulful purpose by who continues onward through time. When their ideas continue to expand when they are no longer here. I think that's where you can find out who was truly genius and who had some sort of very close relationship to what we could call truth. So, Edgar Cayce is called the Sleeping Prophet, the American Prophet. He was based out of Virginia Beach, and he lived during the 1900s through the Depression era. And so when he was asked, and this I think is just very fascinating. So he was asked, when he did his readings, he did a lot of personal readings for individuals, a lot of health readings, relationship readings. But then later in his career, he did a lot more that had to do with things like Atlantis or Lemuel or other ancient civilizations and astrology. He's talked about the planets as being learning schools in different phases. He really went into a lot of esoteric things that when he wasn't in that state, that hypnotic trance state where he was accessing the Akashic Records, he had no idea about these things. Now obviously when he started talking about them, he probably did more research. But so when Cayce was asked about the source of the information he was getting, he said there were two places that he got his information. So let me start from the beginning. So somebody would write Cayce, and they would ask particular questions to get a reading. Now what Cayce would do is he would lay down on a couch, cross his arms on his chest, and he was called the Sleeping Prophet because he entered a trance state. So he would enter this deep trance state, and then he was led by what you could call there's a specific word for it. Not an engineer, but it was a guide. Her name was Gladys that worked with Edgar, and she would ask him the questions while he was in this trance state. So Gladys would lead the reading and ask Cayce these questions as he was in this trance state. And Casey was very particular about how he got this information. He would make sure that he went on his own, that the journey was, it was only him going directly to the records. So sometimes there are people who are considered mediums, and they will allow other spirits or ghosts or other energies to communicate through them. But Casey didn't want to do this because he wanted to get to the truth himself. Now, there are some readings where these entities would use Casey's body and speak through him. It's really fascinating. But he said before that he would do his best to avoid these other entities, or just to make sure that he himself got to the records, to the Akashic Records. So I want to describe his process, the way he told it. And so, once again, he would get his information from two places. And so, if he was doing a reading for somebody, he would use their subconscious mind for the individual, and then he would also read the Akashic Records as well. And so this is, and it's hard to understand maybe what the distinction there is. Is there a big distinction or not? I'm not sure. What's the relation? I mean, you would think somebody's subconscious mind would be recorded in the records, but maybe the soul is something that's even deeper. It's hard to say. So this is Casey's own description. I see myself as a tiny dot out of my physical body, which lies inert before me. I find myself oppressed by darkness, and there's a feeling of terrific loneliness. Suddenly, I am conscious of a white beam of light. As this tiny dot, I move upward following the light, knowing that I must follow it or be lost. As I move along this path of light, I gradually become conscious of various levels upon which there is movement. Upon the first levels, there are vague, horrible shapes, grotesque forms, such as one sees in nightmares. Passing on, there begin to appear on either side misshapen forms of human beings, with some part of the body magnified. Again, there's change, and I become conscious of gray hooded forms moving downward. Gradually, these become lighter in color. Then the direction changes, and these forms move upward, and the color of the robes grows rapidly lighter. Next, there begin to appear on either side vague outlines of houses, walls, trees, etc., but everything is motionless. As I pass on, there is more light and movement in what appear to be normal cities and towns. With the growth of movement, I become conscious of sounds, at first indistinct rumblings, then music, laughter, and singing of birds. There is more and more light, the colors become very beautiful, and there is the sound of wonderful music. The houses are left behind. Ahead, there's only a blending of sound and color. Quite suddenly, I come upon a hall of records. It is a hall without walls, without ceiling, but I am conscious of seeing an old man who hands me a large book, a record of the individual for whom I seek information. I mean, it's almost incomprehensible, like what that is. To me, it sounds like he's traveling through these different planes of existences, that he's moving past kind of the lower levels of the misshapen individuals to the forms, which almost like the houses and trees almost reminds me of like platonic forms of their existence there. And then even past that, he comes to the Hall of Records where everything is recorded. And it's interesting, the old man who hands him a large book with the records, maybe he did have somebody who was helping him, or a spiritual guide, or the keeper of the records or something. And so Edgar Casey also suggests that each of us write our own story and write our own way through the book, and through our thoughts and our deeds, and through our ethical actions. And that this impacts our life here, and impacts our life moving forward, but it also impacts everybody's life. That we're all interconnected, that when we do something, we are writing it into the fabric of existence. And so it's, the saying goes that we are our brother's keeper. Well, it takes on a whole nother level of meaning when we realize that our thoughts are helping to shape the reality that we all share together. That our feelings, actions, emotions all combine into what we are all individually experiencing. That we have this responsibility for ourselves, but for the world. Jiddu Krishnamurti said that I am the world, you are the world. And he means that in a very literal way. And so there's a great, great responsibility, and it can feel heavy. But I think it's the big question of being a human being, of being endowed with this consciousness that we have, the thing that separates us from the animals. I think it comes down to the ethical question. It comes down to this interconnectedness, and it's asking us, what are you going to do about it? You are connected. You are everything. Your inner state, who you are, your being, is the being of mankind. So what are you going to do? Like that's the question looking at us, right? And it's probably one of the reasons a lot of us may stray from religion. I mean, there's plenty of reasons to stray from organized religion, but those are big, important things. And I think that's one of the places religion goes wrong for me is that it will tell you the answer to that question. Because when you realize that you are the world and you have responsibility for yourself and for the world around you, that the anger, that the jealousy, the judgmentalism that you see throughout the world is in you. Like, that's a big question. That's hard to deal with. What are you going to do about it? And I think religion tries to tell you what to do about it. And I think people get lost either by just following along or they treat the question itself superficially. And I think we're starting to realize this. I think maybe one of the results of this interconnectedness that we have now, technologically and socially, is that we realize how connected we truly are. And maybe we realize, our inadequacies are so intense to us. So many people seem anxious, depressed, just sad in general. But it's because they're starting to see this question that's being put to them. And that question is, what are you going to do about the ethical, moral situation that the world finds itself in? And it's overwhelming. But the question remains. So, I hope part of what we can do in this podcast series and as this develops and moves forward is to address that question. How are we going to answer it? What does it mean to address it and answer it, right? So I think it's such a big question. I should have we should have plenty to continue forward with our discussions and learning. Okay, so the last thing I wanted to touch on has to do with science and what we're learning. So, without going into the very specific details, which I'm probably not good enough to explain, of what the new physics, the quantum physics, has taught us. It's one thing that it's shown definitely is the interconnectedness of all life. Um, and we see this even in strange phenomena such as non locality, where electrons and things seem to be connected across great distances that can move simultaneously through this connection, which defies the speed of light. So, when we. Yeah, it's very hard to explain, but, there are physicists who say that consciousness is the primary reality. And this goes along with a lot of spiritual teachings as well. That, they would say spirit is the primary foundation, or that God himself is, and that it's something other than this physical nature. And so we can see the connectedness. And I think it helps explain things like intuition. It helps explain dreams. It helps explain knowing things that we couldn't have possibly known. That underneath it all, maybe foundational, is something like consciousness, or the Akashic Records, or the quantum vacuum, right? However you want to explain that. And I think there's so much more for us to discover. And I think that's one of the big calls for us as humans is, well, are you going to do the work to discover it or not? And I think that's available to us. And, as we move forward, I'll go into more methods. But, doing certain meditations, certain health habits, learning about certain mantras or the law of attraction, learning how to get into a hypnagogic state, how to enter a trance state, how to use shamanic drumming to fuel your journeys, how to access your imaginative realm, how to do subtle energy work, how to stimulate your chakras. Okay? I know a lot of people like using crystals and scents and all of that, music tones, and there's something to that. But I think there's a more direct path that we can actually stimulate our chakras. We can help clear them. And part of that is meditative, imaginative, physical. Some of it's yoga. Some of it's exercise and eating habits. But some of it's also ethical. Certain ethical actions can help us open our chakras. And that's something I don't see many people talk about. They'll tell you to get this crystal or this oil, draw this diagram. It's all nice. But if we want results, I think we need to look a little bit deeper into these things. So I think that's going to wrap up the podcast for today on the Akashic Records. And, well, lastly, I do want to give you something that you can work with practically, and that is a seed meditation. So, and this has a lot to do with the Akashic Records too, I kind of alluded to the idea that a thought is something that can be planted in the soil, and that soil will help to nurture that seed, but we also have to do some nurturing ourselves to make sure it grows and sprouts and develops. So what you want to do for this meditation, and it's even good to have a seed if you can find a seed, and to hold it and to imagine the tree that exists within that seed. Spend your time first just observing it in its form as it is. Then spend your time seeing it as it can be, as the full tree or flower, depending on what kind of seeds you have. If you can do this every day, this will help you to realize the potential that lies in all things. And not only that, it'll help you to realize that that tree, the fully grown, mature tree, exists within the seed. And in the same way, the future you want to manifest, the relationship, the things, exist within the seed that is your thought. So if you can nurture that thought, nurture that seed, and if you can see, have, hold, feel that end result that you really want, then that soil will help it to grow. So that's the seed meditation. I think it's a great way to break in. Rudolf Steiner recommended it. And it's a good way to start to develop your spiritual side as well. So, that'll be all for today. Until next time, goodbye.